I want to really start this paper by sketching where we've got to in these equality seminars, and then trying to bring them all together and suggest one way in which we can move forward from the papers that we've had so far. And I've tried to represent in this diagram on the front page of the handout one way of construing what's happened over these 4 seminars that we've had. Reading down the first column, in the first seminar, Oliver Davies came and spoke about Rancière and declarative and active equality. And Rancière argues that any defence of inequality must itself necessarily presuppose equality. And just to refresh our memories, this is quotation 1 on the handout. Il y a de l'ordre dans la société parce que les uns commandent et que les autres obéissent. Mais pour obéir à un ordre, 2 choses au moins sont requises. Il faut comprendre l'ordre et il faut comprendre qu'il faut lui obéir. Et pour faire cela, il faut déjà être l'égal de celui qui vous commande. C'est cette égalité qui range tout ordre naturel. So then, for Rancière, everyone who has the capacity to understand an order that they're given is de facto equal with the one giving the order. And for Rancière, this exposes the utter contingency of the current order and the equality of any speaking being with any other speaking being. And the assumption of equality here for Rancière isn't just wishful thinking, because it creates a space where equality can stake its claim, where it can be verified or acted upon. But in the question time following Oliver's paper, there were 2 issues in particular that were raised that I want to refresh our memories about and focus on now. And I've represented them in the first column of the diagram. The first was that it remained unclear why we should wish to verify equality. So equality might well be the way that things happen to be, but that doesn't necessarily in and of itself mean that it's the way things should be. And secondly, it seemed problematic that equality was rooted through the capacity to speak or to understand. What, for example, about those who can't speak or who are unable to understand? What about the very young, the very old, the disabled? Are they equal too? It's a problem for Rancière. The second seminar was on the politics of finitude, with an important, though not an exclusive, emphasis on Jean-Luc Nancy. And Nancy was seen to provide an account that avoided this capacity problem, as I'm calling it, because Nancy's account of equality isn't rooted in any capacity or in any determinate trait whatsoever. It's rooted in what Nancy calls his singular plural ontology. And what the singulars have in common is precisely that they've got nothing in common. Each one, Nancy says, is incommensurable with every other. And that incommensurability itself is the only basis for equality. It's not an equality of intelligence, it's not an equality of the capacity to speak or anything else, but all are equally incommensurable. Now this position does indeed resolve, to my mind, the capacity problem, but it leaves open another problem, the is-ought problem. I think it leaves it open in the following way. It's on the basis of singular plural ontology that appeal is made to respect or honour this equality in the way people are treated. So in Nancy's terms, quotation 2, Tout d'abord, nous sommes en commun. Ensuite, nous devons devenir ce que nous sommes. La donnée est celle d'une exigence, et celle-ci est infinie. Or as Martin puts it in L'Ensemble, quotation 3, Celle-ci, talking about an egalitarian politics, n'est assurément donnée par aucune ontologie. Il se peut bien qu'elle soit néanmoins appelée par toute ontologie qui pose, comme on aime à le dire aujourd'hui, l'égalité de chacun avec chacun. So that singular plural ontology may not constrain us to an egalitarian politics, but it does call for an egalitarian politics. There's a demand to verify or to honour the singular plural ontology in our dealings with each other. But nevertheless, the is-ought problem remains. If equality is our singular plural condition, why, playing devil's advocate, why on that basis alone must we understand this ontological condition to be calling for an egalitarian politics? And I think a thought experiment just helps to illustrate this. It's possible, although objectionable, to imagine an ontological condition that it would be repugnant to turn into a politics. So then, is it because singular plurality is ontological, or is it because it's egalitarian that we demand that this ontology be verified? Would we want to verify an in-egalitarian ontology, for example? Now, in addition to Nancy's resolution of the capacity problem and the way in which the is-ought problem persists, the Nancian position, I think, also introduced a new problem into our thinking of equality. And I've chosen to refer to it with the shorthand on the diagram of the escalator problem. It emerged at the end of the question time after Martin's paper that if the only thing in common is incommensurability, then why stop at other people? Why not animals? Why not plants? Why not life? And so on and so on. And I'm calling this the escalator problem because it seems hard to justify getting off this escalator halfway up. It's hard to draw the line at humans or at animals or at any point on that trajectory. Now, we've only got really time to look at one of those problems this afternoon, so I've chosen to take this is-ought question and devote this paper to that problem in particular, and to look at it in dialogue with Nancy. And my starting point for the intervention that I'm going to try and construct is this question. How are we to think the relation between the fact of equality and the demand or imperative for equality? Now, it's worth saying that I'm not suggesting Rancière has nothing to say on this, but I'm choosing Nancy because of his response to the capacity problem. And therefore I think he's, in a sense, already a little further on. So I'm going to look at this through Nancy this afternoon. And in looking at this, I want to really take my lead from what Kevin Inston was talking about in the last of these equality papers. Kevin was using the notion of affect, pity, in Rousseau, to motivate people to act on equality, exploring how that works in Rousseau. And I want to continue and broaden that exploration of affect in the approach that I'm going to take to Nancy today. And I want to elaborate a response to this is-ought problem by following the way in which Nancy talks about love in particular. But before we can get into seeing what Nancy does with love, I think we've got to spend a little moment just thinking about the question, this is-ought question. Because I think in order to do it justice in any reasonable terms, we've got to recognise that it's not really one problem, but it's two problems in one. First of all, there's the problem of moving from an is to an ought, from an equality that is recognised to exist to an equality that ought to exist. But also there's the problem of moving from a thought to an action. Because if equality is an imperative, then it can't be simply something that's thought. It ought to be something that's done. And therefore it's dangerous, I think, in responding to this is-ought problem, to assume that a response to the is-ought problem alone will immediately, in and of itself, lead to action, like in figure 2 on the handout. The assumption there is that dealing with is-ought will, in and of itself, lead to doing something about equality. But I don't think that's an accurate way to set things up. And I think its falsity is actually empirically verifiable. All of us here and everyone else in Cambridge this evening could make a list of things that we probably ought to do, and also a list of things that we certainly ought to do, but that nevertheless we haven't done. So I think we're making an unwarranted jump if we assume that we'll do what we ought to do simply by virtue of thinking that we ought to do it. You see, in moving from an is to an ought, we've merely moved from thinking the is to thinking the ought, not from thought to action at all. And I've represented that in figure 3. Now what we need to get from thought to action is not just a reason, but what I'm going to call a shove, a kick or a push, to get us from understanding that we ought to act on equality to actually acting on it. And I've represented that in figure 4. We need both to think about the problem of the is and the ought, but we also need to think about the question of thought and action. And I'd like to deal with each of these in turn this afternoon. First, by showing that love provides a shove to action, and then by showing how love jumps this is-ought gap. So first then, love provides a shove to action. In L'Adoration, Nancy has got a fascinating passage where he places love at the very heart of singular plural ontology. And for the record, it's pages 86 to 90. Nancy begins by noting that the Greek agape, translated into English as love or brotherly love, sometimes as charity or benevolence, has as its Latin cognate caritas, from caros, meaning costly, beloved or dear. In other words, this word for love in Latin comes from the lexicon of value and cost. But the value in question, Nancy goes on to explain, isn't any determinate numerical value. Charity, he says, affirms a unique price, an incommensurable price for each one. And this is what we mean when Nancy says, following Kant, we talk about human dignity, this incommensurable price of each one. So then, right at the beginning, we see that love is not being understood by Nancy primarily as a feeling, or even primarily as a disposition, but in terms of a recognition of value. Love recognizes the incommensurable value of the beloved. And furthermore, Nancy goes on, what is in love, what is incommensurable in me, addresses itself to what is incommensurable in the other. And this notion of address is important for Nancy in L'Adoration. And indeed, it's what he means by adoration itself. This is quotation 4. Adoratio, la parole adressée. Oratio, parole solennelle, parole avant tout tenue, tension de la voix, de la bouche et de tout le corps parlant. Parole dont le contenu est inséparable, voire indiscernable de l'adresse. Langage soutenu, qui se distingue de sermon, langage ordinaire. Prière, invocation, adresse, appel, adjuration, imploration, célébration, dédicace, salutation. Et plus exactement, non pas l'un ou l'autre de ces registres, mais une composition de tous ensemble. Et d'abord, ou pour finir, un salut. Oui, le simple salut participe de l'adoration. So then, adoration, adoration, is a speaking towards. It's the address of communication that isn't given in communication itself. It is not what is communicated, but the address through which what is communicated is communicated. It's necessary for the exchange of information, but it is not itself a datum. It's not given, it's not exchanged. And in this way, the relation between adoration and information is analogous to the relation elsewhere in Nancy between sens and signification. And this identification of love with address is not new to Nancy in l'adoration. Back in the essay Jouir est le souci in une pensée finie, Nancy was already arguing that the name of love is not, quote-unquote, love, l'amour, but I love you, je t'aime. Love is not a substance or a faculty, much less a feeling. Love is a movement and an address. And it's in this adoration of the other, in my address to the other, regardless of the content that's communicated in that address, that love, for Nancy, asserts to the uniqueness of each one. This is quotation 5. Ainsi l'amour atteste chacun comme unique, mais d'une unicité qui excède l'un de chacun. Cette attestation est proprement impossible. Elle ne saurait être présentée, effectuée, mais c'est elle que demande l'existence nue, sans outre-monde et sans essence. So then, what have we got in this quotation? We've got the notion of a bare existence requiring or demanding the attestation of the uniqueness of each one. And that is now familiar territory for us, because it echoes back to the dynamic that Martin explored and that I referred to in quotation 2. First we're in common, then we must become what we are. But now there are two further elements that we've added to that picture. First, it's now love that attests to this in-commonness. It's love that responds to the demand. It's love that answers the call. And secondly, it's no longer simply a call and response structure, because for the Nancy of l'adoration, love is also an experience of the real. This is quotation 6. L'amour est toujours aussi dans l'amour érotique une pensée au sens de l'expérience d'un réel. Si réel veut toujours aussi dire dehors. So then, love isn't simply a response to the demand of singular plurality, but it is itself an experience of singular plurality, of the other, of the outside. Now, Nancy tantalizingly doesn't explain what he means by experience here, but I think he means that love is the experience of the real, in the sense that when I love, I think, I feel, I hold myself in a way that corresponds to the real of the singular plural spacing. And that real is an outside because the other is incommensurable with me. And if love is an experience of the real of singular plural spacing, then love is indissociable from equality, especially but not exclusively the agapic love that doesn't just love the lovable, but that loves everybody. And this is quotation 7. L'amour, dit chrétien, est strictement indissociable de l'égalité. Kierkegaard le formule de manière rigoureuse. Le prochain, en effet, étant tout homme inconditionnellement, nulle différence ne le signale. Et l'amour qu'on lui porte se reconnaît précisément à ce que son objet est donné sans aucune spécification différentielle. En d'autres termes, cet amour se reconnaît uniquement à l'amour. Cet amour est donc exigible pour tous, non par un sentiment tendre qui se porterait vers tous et chacun, tour à tour ou en masse, mais parce qu'il est en lui-même essentiellement et ensemble, uniquement, position de l'égalité. So equality itself, justice itself, we could say, in another register, is the quote-unquote position of equality. In other words, to love is to attest to the unique price of each one. And to attest to that price is to practice equality. Not a feeling, not an affect, of equality, but Nancy says a position of equality, where position, I think, has the force of a gerund. It's a posing, it's a positing of equality, a positioning of oneself with respect to and with respect for equality. Now elsewhere in La Pensée dérobée, Nancy's term for such a posing, such a holding oneself in a particular way in the world, such a synthesis of concept and affect, the term for that is ethos. And this term, Nancy explains in La Pensée dérobée, has two meanings. On the one hand, ethos means presence and disposition. And on the other hand, it means a stay, séjour, or behaviour. And these two meanings blend in this motif of holding oneself, la tenue. And it's such a holding, Nancy argues, that's at the bottom of every ethics. That's from La Création du Monde, page 36. So then, ethos for Nancy is no moral philosophy that's derived from a first philosophy, but it's rather a thinking of being that's neither simply ethical nor merely ontological, neither theoretical nor practical, simply. And the importance of tracing love and ethos in this way, as I've taken time to do, is that it redraws the way we need to think about our problem of moving from thought to action. Because what we're presented with in the problem of moving from thought to action is not, we need to recognise now, a pure philosophical question, shorn of its own position in the world. What we're presented with is an ethos, a way of holding oneself in the world, out of which and in accordance with which it makes sense to ask a particular question, namely, how do you move from thought to action? In other words, the question itself isn't neutral. It implies and issues from a particular ethos, one way of holding oneself in the world to the exclusion of others, such that this question, how do you move from thought to action, is the question that we'd want to ask in a particular situation. So any thought then, any question, is addressed within a given situation, cannot help taking up a position in the world. To use a rather contrived example, just to put some flesh on these bones for a second, if I see a baby being tortured in front of me, and I decide to write a paper on the moral complexities of the torture of infants, then I do not escape, by virtue of that decision, holding myself in a particular way within that situation. In this case, in a particularly problematic way. You know, as Pascal said, we're all on board. We never ask a question from a position outside all positions, but always from within a particular position, expressing a particular position. So then the first response that I'm offering to this thought to action problem is simply that it's a false dichotomy. Whether we like it or not, thought, insofar as it must take place within and issue from a particular ethos, is already implicated in action. And inaction is just as committed, in this sense, as any energetic action. So then the question isn't how to move from thought to action, but given that we are always already holding ourselves in a particular way, what sort of action should we be undertaking? The question is, why the ethos of love rather than any other? And that's where we need a shove. Back in this passage from l'Adoration about love, Nancy talks about love as an urge or an impulse. This is quotation 8. C'est à ce prix, à cette valeur inestimable que s'adresse l'adoration. Elle est l'évaluation de l'inévaluable. Or, nous y sommes portés, nous y sommes poussés. Et c'est pourquoi il faut comprendre dans la vertu l'énergie de la pulsion. We're not brought to love by evaluating our options and considering that on balance love perhaps would be the best course of action to take. Love doesn't respond to a proof, but rather the experience of inestimable value and adoration, quote-unquote, carry or quote-unquote push us. Now, Nancy goes on to extrapolate on and to justify this shove, but he doesn't justify it in terms of offering an argument or a proof for it. Rather, he appeals to experience. This is quotation 9. Pourquoi cette poussée? Parce que l'homme est l'être du sens, et que le sens, qu'on peut aussi nommer la valeur, est inévaluable. Il est valeur absolue. L'amour des autres, dans son apparence de niaiserie sentimentale et dans toute sa réalité de disposition impossible, tant pour la psychologie que pour la sociologie, indique simplement la valeur vers laquelle nous sommes tournés du seul fait de notre existence fortuite, que nous le voulions ou non, que nous le croyions ou non, en tant que nous sommes pris dans le sens ou que notre être est un être de sens. I want to make 2 points off the back of this quotation. The first one's affirmative, and the second one will be cautiously critical. First of all, then, the incommensurable value in each one that Nancy has been calling love, in this quotation he now calls sense. And human beings simply are orientated towards sense, whether we like it or not. We simply do adore, we simply do address, invoke, appeal, celebrate, pray, and everything else that Nancy mentioned in quotation 4. Now what Nancy is doing here is he's not giving us an incontrovertible reason to love, bludgeoning us into some dialectical corner where we submit and reluctantly start loving. But he's giving us an incitement, a push, or what elsewhere in l'adoration he calls enthusiasm. Now we don't need a reason to move from thought to action, because at the end of the day that'd simply be to think the move from thought to action within thought. Wouldn't really get us from thought to action at all. Now what we need is enthusiasm. But before we look at enthusiasm in more detail, I want to strike a cautiously critical note about quotation 9 as well. Nancy says that humanity is a being of sense. But I wonder, does that mean only humanity falls into this category? All humans are beings of sense. What about the brain dead? What about the senile? What about the coma victim? What about the fetus? Now, it seems as if Nancy is really between a rock and a hard place at this point. If a being of sense is simply a being that has an incommensurable value, then why not animals? Why not plants? On the other hand, if that incommensurable value needs to be seconded or underpinned with some sort of distinctively human capacity to apprehend or negotiate it, to address or to adore it, then where does that leave coma victims and so on? It seems that Nancy must either at this point return to Rancière's capacity problem through his notion of sense, or face the escalator problem. Sadly, I'm not able to say anything more about that. Take us too far away. I want to come back now to the is-ought problem that's supposed to be what we're dealing with in this paper. And so far, just to recap, we've seen that Nancy sees the move to action as a shove that gives us enthusiasm. In l'adoration, Nancy begins his passage on enthusiasm, like the passage on love, with an etymological excursus. Enthusiasm is etymologically a passage into God, or a sharing of the divine. And the problem, Nancy continues, is that the death of God seems to have spelled the end of enthusiasm as well. And Nancy responds to what he sees as this deficit in enthusiasm with love. We must begin, he says, not by confusing the fervour of enthusiasm with the fury of fascism, because fascism always refers to a closed or determined figure, the people, the party, the leader, the idea, the vision. And that's not adoration, says Nancy. That's adulation. But the fervour of adoration, by contrast, comes in the love that accords or recognises the unique and incalculable value in every other, both for the lovers in the throes of passion and in desiring that passion for all beings. And this is quotation 10. Elle est ferveur pour l'existence multiple et singulière, pour chacune donc, tour à tour, pour chacune à l'exclusion des autres, et cependant pour toutes, en doit et en fait au moins pour plusieurs qui répondent à plusieurs modes de cet amour unique et polymorphe. So then the reason that you can't compel this enthusiasm with any reason or idea is that it pertains to love or sense, to the incommensurable that exceeds any idea or concept. And we can go further. There emphatically cannot and must not be a sufficient reason for enthusiasm, because that would reduce enthusiasm to the fury of signification, of a particular idea of the other. That would be, in Nancy's terms, a fascistic reduction of giving to the gift. Now, at this point, there's one possible objection to this that I think it's important to address before we go any further, and it's this. If love and enthusiasm are to do with adoration, not information, if they're to do with sense, not signification, with giving, not with the gift, then don't they remain hopelessly remote from intervening in the name of singular plural equality in any concrete situations? Well, Nancy addresses this very point in Une pensée finie. I think it's important to introduce this at this point. Quotation 11. Parler de sens et de vérité au milieu de l'agitation militaire, des calculs géopolitiques, des souffrances, des grimaces de bêtises ou de mensonges n'est pas idéaliste. C'est toucher à la chose même. And here the thing itself is this ethos of equality, this ethos of love, which is the only thing that can generate enthusiasm for concrete political action in specific situations. Criticising a position or an argument without addressing the ethos that gives it its shape will always fall short. If it does produce any concrete effect, it'll only be an effect of brute force or of intimidation. So then, to conclude this first section, the question that we've been looking at is this. What gets us from thought to action? What gives us a shove to do something about equality rather than simply thinking about it? And I've offered two responses to that question. The first was that there is no, quote-unquote, just thinking about it for Nancy. The ethos of love as a holding of oneself in the world is always both a concept and an affect. And any argument or question always takes up a position in relation to a situation. And secondly, I've argued that we're shoved towards love by the experience of the other's incommensurability in a way that can't be reduced to a sufficient reason for action. I now want to turn to the second claim that I'm going to make in this paper. Even if love does shove us to action, which is what I have argued for so far, is that shove justified? Perhaps we are pushed to love, someone might say, but ought we to let ourselves be pushed? In other words, how does love relate to this is-ought question? And my argument's going to be that love does indeed provide a response to the is-ought question, but it does so not by justifying the move from an is to an ought, but by circumscribing and exceeding what I'm calling the logic of justification that's been assumed to govern this move. And the logic of justification is simply a challenge to justify, to provide a sufficient reason for the movement from an is to an ought. In trying to argue this, it's important to begin by understanding the place that love holds in relation to philosophy and to philosophical reasoning for Nancy. In the essay Le cœur brisé in une pensée finie, Nancy introduces love in a way that should now be familiar to us, from the link between love and sense that we saw in l'adoration. Love is something, he says, which diffuses itself through everything. It's the principle, the movement, or the proximity of the neighbour. In the language of l'adoration, it's the experience of the real. So then, how are we to think about love in the light of this diffusion of love through everything? Well, in Le Cœur brisé, in the course of a discussion of Plato's Symposium, Nancy argues that we need to stop thinking about love in terms of possibility and impossibility. At this point, I think he's drawing a line between himself and Derrida. This is quotation 12. Il ne faudra plus penser en termes de possibilité et d'impossibilité. Il faudra tenir que la mort est toujours présente et jamais reconnue en rien de ce que nous nommons amour. So love is present, but it can't be presented in any name, least of all the name of love. It's that by which any naming is given, but it itself cannot be given in naming. And therefore, Nancy continues, love is always missed by philosophy, because it only arrives on the limit, through or across what is said, not in it. And love is the address of any proposition or argument. And with address here, remember the way in which Nancy talked about adoration in l'adoration. Love is not an extra message or datum, but it's the address that makes possible any message, while at the same time escaping it. And those of us familiar with Nancy's work will see here the shape of a thinking that we encounter elsewhere in the Nancian corpus. Just one example in his discussion of faith and reason in Une foi de rien du tout in la déclosion. Nancy argues that reason, in order to be what it is, relies on a faith that is nothing other than reason holding itself to itself. So also here, in the case of love and thought, love is necessary for thought to be what it is, not a contradiction or even a supplement to what thought is. As faith is the blind spot of reason for Nancy, love is the blind spot of thought. So then, love and philosophy are not to be seen, if we're thinking them in Nancian terms, as two opposite poles. Love is not the contradiction of thought, such that either you follow the dictates of thought, or you surrender yourself to the charms of love. No, love is rather, as Nancy puts it, the contradiction of contradiction and non-contradiction. In other words, love doesn't set itself up in opposition to thought, but it upsets its opposition with thought. In fact, Nancy continues in Une pensée finie, this understanding of the relation between love and thought, love and justice, as I'm going to argue in a second as well, is right at the heart of our Western tradition. Quotation 13. Comme de juste, cette pensée de la philosophie n'est pas cantonnée au seul discours philosophique, ni à son avatar théologique. Il est facile de reconnaître qu'elle structure toute expérience et toute l'expression occidentale de l'amour. Il n'est pas certain que l'Occident ici ne comprenne pas en lui l'islam et le bouddhisme. L'amour est double, conflictuel ou ambivalent, nécessaire et impossible, doux et amer, libre et enchaîné, spirituel et sensuel, vivifiant et mortel, lucide et aveugle, altruiste et égoïste. Chez tous, ces couples d'opposition constituent la structure même et la vie de l'amour, tandis que celui-ci, en même temps, effectue la résolution ou le dépassement de ces mêmes oppositions, ou, plutôt, Il les dépasse et il les maintient à la fois. And if this works in Nancy for love and thought, it also works for love and justice, where justice is understood as calculated equal distribution, a thoughtful application of the principle that equals should be treated equally. So then, in terms of the relation between love and justice, it's not that love is opposed to justice. It's not that we've got to brush justice under the carpet in order to love. Rather, it's that love itself is the contradiction of the binary choice between, on the one hand, contradiction, where contradiction says love and justice are irreconcilable, and on the other hand, non-contradiction, where non-contradiction says love is justice. Or, in other slightly denser words, love is the contradiction of the non/contradiction of the logic of justification that's been governing our thinking about this move from is to ought. So then the question, are we justified in moving from is to ought, is itself addressed in love. And that love both contradicts and resolves the exhaustivity of its contradictory terms. The question, in other words, can't reasonably be answered simply with a yes or a no, without ignoring the fact that love is already diffused through it. In order to get to the point where the thinking of the move from an is to an ought is a problem, we must already be in love. Because without love there is no thought. So justice, therefore, justice is never justice simpliciter, without love. But justice is always the justice of love. The justice that relies on and is given by love. In the same way that signification is always the signification of sense. So then, my first argument in trying to substantiate this second claim is as follows. In the very giving of reasons and justifications, there's always already love. Without love, there could be no reasons or justifications in the first place. But in order to respond to this second claim more adequately, I need to add a second argument. And this is it. This love that's at the root of justification and the giving of reasons does not itself obey the logic of justification. This love does not justify itself. In Nancy's terms, it is madness and folly. And in order to try and show this, we're back in Nancy's discussion of love in l'Adoration. And a particular passage where Nancy says that love, in addressing the incommensurable in the other, escapes from all mastery. This is quotation 14. L'amour déclare l'impossible même, folie, dit le christianisme. Il avance un geste exorbitant pour qui le reçoit comme pour qui le donne. S'il est donc impossible de faire cette distinction. Et il échappe à la maîtrise qui permettrait de proprement le donner ou le recevoir. So then love cuts across the categories of the logic of justification. It cuts across what justification needs to establish itself in order to begin its calculations, namely giving and receiving, debt and credit, profit and loss. Love doesn't satisfy the logic of justification. Love challenges the logic of justification. And it doesn't merely challenge it from the outside, but it shows how the logic of justification is a challenge to itself. How the logic of justification is the contradiction of its own contradiction and non-contradiction. In other words, the demand for justification itself relies on a love that it cannot justify. And rather than love having to obey the logic of justification, we see that justification is always already itself obeying the madness of love. So then what happens if someone comes along and accuses love of lacking justification? In other words, what happens when someone says, justify this move from an is to an ought? I think we need to respond in two ways. First, we need to acknowledge that love does indeed lack justification. Like the Pope is Catholic, like bears defecate in the woods, love lacks justification. But secondly, we also need to continue that while love may fall short of or exceed justification, justification itself does not lack love. And so the madness of love is affirmed well enough, thank you very much, by the challenge to justify it. The accusation that love falls short of justification is merely rehearsing the constitutive risk of love. It's merely repeating what makes love what it is. This is quotation 15. C'est le moment où il s'agit de poser et d'opposer, puis de résorber le même et l'autre, mais où l'affirmation « je t'aime » est livrée à ce qui ne lui est ni contradictoire ni non contradictoire. Le risque que l'autre ne m'aime pas, ou bien le risque que je ne tienne pas la promesse de mon amour. So to accuse love of lacking justification is, to be sure, to refuse to return love. It's the risk that the other will not love in turn. It may be a sadness, but it's by no means a challenge to love's own risk. Someone else might come along and say, well, this position, it just seems terribly weak, anemic, a naive love that can't stand up to brute power, that can only make positive noises about equality but can't deliver equality. It's the suspicion that this amounts to nothing more than a philosophical hugger-huddy policy. Well, Nancy anticipates this objection and he addresses it in l'Adoration, number 16. Il est une objection bien connue. On demande s'il faudra donc aimer les criminels et les abrutis. Cette objection confond un amour de désir ou de tendresse et l'amour de justice, qu'implique la considération de la dignité incommensurable, et même incommensurable à la personne elle-même. C'est au fond ce sur quoi repose leur refus de la peine de mort. So what is this love a love of? Well, it's a love of justice, of what Nancy elsewhere calls the just measure of the width, the singular plural spacing of what love, of which love is the experience. Now, we've already established that justice is the justice of love, in the sense that the demand for justification relies on love for its articulation, for its address. And here we now see that love is the love of justice. And with this, I think we've got the final move in responding to the question of justification. And it's this. Love is the love of justice. And there is no justice without the love of justice. Let me now try and tie this all together in a conclusion. We began with the problem of justification. When we're thinking about equality, how can we justify moving from constative, actually existing equalities to imperative demands that such and such an equality should be normative? And I began by saying that this is really two questions in one. It's the question of what gets us from an equality as a fact to an equality as a norm, but it's also, and irreducibly I think, the question of what gets us from thinking about equality to doing something about it. And then I made two arguments in relation to those 2 points, and both of them had to do with love. First of all, love gets us from equality as a fact to equality as a norm by showing that the logic of justification that's necessarily supposed by the fact to norm reasoning itself relies on love. and therefore love needs no justification. Rather, justification needs love. And love gets us from a thinking to a doing, first by reminding us that every thinking necessarily strikes a pose in the world that is inseparable from behaviour, and secondly, by providing us with a shove, with a dose of enthusiasm. Now, I'm not claiming that this is any silver bullet. Every account of equality is going to have its weaknesses. If indeed we understand the failure to satisfy the logic of justification as a weakness. But what we do need, I think, is an account that has a way of dealing with its weaknesses. And love, as I've been trying to show from Nancy, has the great virtue of dealing with and of needing its weakness, namely its risk, its failure to satisfy the logic of justification. So where does this leave us? It leaves us, I think, with an account of equality that's not just more internally coherent and robust, but also more motivating. An equality of love your neighbour, where merely to think about loving our neighbour without doing anything about it is no longer simply a failure to move from understanding to action, but it is now itself a fundamental misunderstanding. Thank you.